Now that all the stories are out about how the trade deadline went down, let's break down the White Sox lack of moves with my guest on today's episode of Locked On White Sox.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan and contributor for SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the FanSided's network, and also I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. Additionally, follow or subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platforms. Sam Phalen of SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the FanSided Network, and of Survivor fame, joined me to discuss the White Sox trade deadline activity a week after the deals went down. Why wait a week to go this in depth? Because you need all the stories to come out on why moves did or did not happen. And now that they're out, I spoke with Sam about the deadline, Josh Rojas annoyingly getting at bats, and another bad look for the Sox taking Hagen Smith with the 5th pick in last year's draft. All right, so Sam, it's still early to see if the White Sox made the right move, but was it wise to only just trade 2 players at the trade deadline?
Two players probably a little bit light. And I think a lot of White Sox fans looking at the record, we're looking at a last place team, even though they are certainly improved over the last few months, and wondering, why didn't you do more? So my take on the White Sox trade deadline is kind of split, because I would make a case that Chris Getz and the Sox were very smart to hold on to Luis Robert Jr. That's one guy I'm glad they did not trade. But certainly when I look at the prices that were paid across Major League Baseball for relief pitchers and the market for those reliever arms, I start to wonder why the Sox, chose to hold on to guys like Steven Wilson and Dan Altavilla, or even somebody like Grant Taylor, to be honest with you, Todd. I would have thought it was crazy that you would be telling me I wanted the White Sox to trade Grant Taylor. But when I look at the prices paid around the league, it feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity.
Now, for those that are about to be like, how could you trade Grant Taylor? And I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. Please explain to the audience how you could technically multiply your assets by trading, say, Grant Taylor so early into his career.
Well, I think one of the questions about Grant Taylor right now is what is the long-term trajectory for him? Because if he's a starting pitcher, okay, it makes sense, right? He was dominant in Birmingham before he was called up. I think he was right on the cusp of being a top 100 prospect in baseball. And probably had he not been promoted, he would certainly be a top 100 prospect in baseball right now. But if he's a relief pitcher, which is how the White Sox are using him in 2025, and Todd, for me, that's not a move that they made out of convenience. They didn't need Grant Taylor in their bullpen this year. It was a move that they sort of made as a precautionary decision to prevent Grant Taylor from injuries because of all the data they had on, pitch extension and whatnot. So I think if that was a precautionary move, and he's probably going to remain a relief pitcher for at least the next few seasons, you flip him now, you're giving a team 6 years of control on an electric back end relief arm. And you look at what the San Diego Padres gave up for a guy like Mason Miller. Now, obviously, Grant Taylor is less proven than one of the better closers in baseball that's very young, but that's the kind of arm you're talking about, is this really high leverage electric arm with years and years of control that a team that needs bullpen help and controllable bullpen help can get really excited about. He could net you multiple top 100 prospects and guys who play the outfield or are premium power bats and fill more of a positional need for the White Sox than a closer might right now.
Yeah, I like how you pointed that out again. Obviously you're probably not going to get the number 3 prospect in all of baseball, but as you said, you could take probably who would have been a top 100 prospect and multiply him for 2 or 3. And I think that's where people miss it. But at the same point,
even if it's just one top 100 prospect, Todd, if you were to assume Grant Taylor right now was still in the minor leagues pitching, what prospect is he in baseball? 50 if the White Sox are lucky, and he had a nice little resurgent on the updated list from MLB.com. I would, in a heartbeat, knowing the needs of the White Sox right now, flip the number 50 prospect in baseball that is a pitcher for a number 50 prospect in baseball that is another outfielder or another middle infielder or, a first baseman that's got 30 homers in the minor leagues, right? Like when we look at the breakdown of the team's needs, you make that trade. I think you can get that and more for Grant Taylor in the market. And so, yeah, it certainly makes me wonder and think about, man, what if Chris Getz had been willing to move him?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like last year. What if he had been willing to move Garrett Crochet? Does he move him in the offseason potentially? If you've got all these guys calling, to just put a bow on the reliever market, though, you look at I was disappointed too that they didn't trade anybody because the reliever market was just insane for what teams were getting. But when you look at it, they have some club control. Steven Wilson's high leverage numbers might not be as good, that type of stuff. Do you look at it and say, okay, well, at least you got the club control. Maybe could you take advantage of the reliever market in the offseason? Or is it one of those things where, teams are probably not looking to load up on relievers because you can sign them so cheaply?
I would love to say teams aren't looking to load up on relievers, but then we see what teams gave up for relievers. And I'm not even just talking about Mason Miller. I mean, you look at the return that the Giants got for Tyler Rogers, and Drew Gilbert plus from the New York Mets. And that's a return that I'm sure a lot of White Sox fans would be excited about had it been some relief arms that they could have sent New York's way. So I really think for Chris Getz and company, it came down to that control that you talk about. People assume a veteran player like Dan Altavilla, who signed a 1-year deal with the White Sox this year, well, why not get rid of him? He's an expiring contract. He's actually not. He's in the same position as Mike Tauchman is. That 1-year deal that comes during arbitration still. So if you want to get that extra year out of control out of him, you can. They've got Steven Wilson for 2 more years. They've got 3 more years out of Tyler Gilbert. Some of these arms that are the premium arms a team might be interested in. The White Sox could be looking internally and saying, well, we bring this guy back next year. We can always trade him again in the offseason, next trade deadline if he's just as good. But looking to find as many controllable bullpen options to have that part of the team figured out at least.
All right, well, let's circle back to Luis Robert Jr. because I'm willing to admit that I can be fine being loud wrong if the White Sox, because I wanted him to be traded. I was very concerned about the injury history and all that, but I get the pennies on the dollar. So I'm willing to admit to being loud wrong because if he ends up earning that $20 million option, it's because it's probably he's playing great. But on the flip side, and this is not like to accuse, but are you prepared to be wrong if he does get injured and how much that could impact the White Sox franchise by not trading off that asset? Or is it like, well, I'd still rather just roll the dice?
Yeah, I think I'm in that boat of I'd still rather roll the dice. And to me, if the reports were true out there that, the market just wasn't there for Luis Robert Jr. at this year's deadline, and if the White Sox are prepared to pick up that $20 million option regardless, I'm not moved by the idea that they could have gotten some team's number 10 prospect just for Luis Robert Jr. Like that doesn't change the dynamics of this rebuild for me enough to jump off of one of the most volatile, but potentially highest end assets you have. If Luis Robert Jr. gets injured tomorrow, knock on wood, and misses the rest of the season, I still think there is a world where the White Sox could pick up his option and the White Sox could trade him at next year's deadline. And really, as the deadline got closer, that's what my Luis Robert Jr. opinion came down to was what's being offered right now is always going to be there, even if he kind of falls back down to his production from earlier in this season. I still think there is a team that is going to take a chance and give you something on his potential and upside and tools. And so I was more than okay with Chris Getz rolling the dice a little bit, hoping Luis Robert Jr. continues this little hot streak that he's on and that, you can pick up that option and potentially cash in the offseason or next year.
Need to take a quick time out for those listening on Apple or Spotify, but I'll be back with more of my conversation with Sam Phalen after the break. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the daily fantasy platform that lets you turn your football predictions into real rewards. Preseason is already heating up and college football isn't far behind. It's a perfect time to lock in your season-long more or less picks for the 2025 football season, all before week 1 kicks off. And whether you've got your eye on a big name quarterback or a breakout running backs, PrizePicks makes it easy to get in on the game. And I love how PrizePicks it's such a simple concept. Joe Burrow is supposed to play tonight. May not get a ton of snaps, so maybe you want to go less on the 65.5 passing yards they have. However, say he does hook up with Jamar Chase for a big gain. Maybe you want to pick more. You just have to decide. And by the way, Chase's more or less is 23.5 receiving yards. The flex play option is a total game changer. Even when one of your pick misses, you can still double your money. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 play. PrizePicks, run your game. And welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And if you can't catch a show on YouTube, Locked On White Sox is available on all major podcast platforms, so make sure to follow or subscribe on places such as Apple or Spotify. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me. All right, I'm going to take some people behind the scenes. I'm actually going to pitch Sam a story because I talked about it on yesterday's show. Is there a possibility that maybe you actually try to approach Luis Robert Jr. about an extension? Because here's just my thinking is, okay, $20 million is still a lot, but could you go to him and say, look, say you did get hurt, I'm going to pay you out, buy you out for $2 million. You're looking at probably $5 million make good for Yohan Moncada. Would it make more sense to say, hey, I'll guarantee you the 40 and maybe even another 45 for like 3 years, knowing that, hey, because the one argument I can sort of buy is there's no long-term option at center field right now. And he still plays an elite defense. So would that be something that it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe should they even try to convince Scott Boras to sign him to an extension?
So yes, and womp womp on your very final sentence, because I love the idea for the White Sox, right? Like right now, the market has been so down on Luis Robert Jr. You understand that we're going to pick up this guy's option for $20 million, but maybe it's the perfect time to say, you know what, Luis? Not only are we going to give you your $20 million right now, but let's lock it in today. We'll sign you to a 4-year, $60 million in total extension. And if you do want to bet on that upside for Luis Robert Jr., you got a player on a really, really good deal. And worst case scenario, you're paying $15 million a year for an excellent defensive center fielder, like you brought up, Todd. And then you don't have to worry about, hey, we're going to trade Luis Robert Jr. at next year's deadline, or we're going to revisit these conversations in the offseason. He's 27 years old right now. He can stay in Chicago through his age 31 season, be here through 2029 and well into what we consider to be the contention window for this team. For every reason, it makes sense for the White Sox. And then that guy, Scott Boras, comes into the picture. And you know, as much as I want to say it makes sense for Luis Robert Jr. too, given the volatility of his career and the injury risk and, the up and down seasons, it would make sense to lock in a multi-year extension. But is Scott Boras going to let him do that? I have a hard time seeing Boras being that guy, knowing that, Luis Robert Jr. is one big 2026 season away from getting $150 million from somebody. So I like the idea. We'll probably write something about it on SouthsideShowdown.com. Makes a ton of sense for the White Sox, but Scott Boras ruins all of these plans all the time.
And the other reason why I wanted to, write about and discuss and pitch it to you too is just because there's so many people that still don't understand, like, why does Luis Robert Jr. have to be traded? It's usually that crowd that is just, they love watching Luis Robert. They still love him being in a White Sox uniform, but it's like, well, it's two ships still passing in the night because of the Scott Boras component. If he was represented by anybody else, I think there's a possibility. There is a world where, for a guy who can still hit left-handed hitters, run the base as well, and play an elite defensive center field, that could be, 15 might be a little bit too rich, but that's still kind of the going rate for veterans these days of, somewhere between 8 to 15 million. So I could see that being, that. And that's where it's like, okay, you don't have a center fielder, but you're right. Scott Boras just is going to be the big hang up. Is it concerning, though, that Chris Getz is earning a reputation as kind of being frustrating and annoying to work with, as Bob Nightingale has reported? Now, we got to take that with a grain of salt because Bob Nightingale also made it sound like nobody wanted to trade for Luis Robert Jr. when throughout the trade deadline, there was at least 3 or 4 teams interested in him.
Is it a bad thing? I don't know. I kind of like it. And maybe it is a bad thing. Time will tell. But I would much rather Chris Getz have this reputation as frustrating to negotiate with, has his asking price, sets his asking price, sticks to his guns, than Chris Getz having this, reputation as being the guy everybody takes advantage of. I think towards the end of the Kenny Williams regime, regardless if Rick Hahn was the GM or not, Kenny Williams started to build the thing being like, need a good trade with the White Sox. But like, I think about the Tampa Bay Rays, right? And probably not great timing for me to say this, considering the White Sox have made 2 trades with the Tampa Bay Rays this season. But whenever a team makes a deal with the Rays, especially regards to pitching or prospects, you always look at it and say, what do they see that we don't see? And they're going to fleece us. They're going to find a way to fleece us. They're not a team that you want to do business with for that very reason. And that's a good thing if you're a Rays fan. And so my hope is that this idea that Chris Getz drives a hard bargain, that he's a tough negotiator, and that you don't always love doing business with him can be a good thing for White Sox fans. I'm not too upset about that.
Although you recently wrote about Adrian Hauser, has his first really bad start since leaving. And here's the other thing is, if you look at the other flip, the one thing is that gives you a little bit of hope is it's almost like the White Sox have become the Milwaukee White Sox, at least when it comes to pitching. They somehow seem to find a way to find the scraps of the Milwaukee Brewers system where they've got a great pitching lab. If guys aren't thriving there, what makes you think they're going to thrive in Chicago? But suddenly it's like that. It seems like those are the 2 front offices that he can do business with, but at the same time, they're willing to do business with anybody.
Yeah, maybe it's like the Walker McKinnon connection this year that is sort of like tying the White Sox to the Brewers, but that does seem to be their favorite team right now. Between the early sort of like Bobby Dahlbeck exchange, where Bobby Dahlbeck's now in AAA for Milwaukee, and the Andrew Vaughn trade for Aaron Savali. Now you've got the White Sox claiming guys like Elvis Peguero and Brian Hudson off waivers. They've just seemed to do a lot of business with Tampa Bay and Milwaukee. Again, analytics tell you that those are 2 teams that you don't always want to be doing business with, but so far the White Sox have come out okay from all of those deals. And I do think some familiarity with that organization being now over with the White Sox probably has a lot to do with that. And a guy like Walker McKinnon, who's worked with some of these pitchers and hitters before and seen what they're like with the day-to-day grind of an MLB season.
All right, need to take another quick time out for those listening on Apple or Spotify, but I'll be back with more of my conversation with Sam Phalen after the break. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. And that's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes it possible. Gametime makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and the lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Gametime is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for the upcoming series against, say, Cleveland. Cleveland is on a heater that got them back in the playoff race. Maybe Chicago can cool them off, and why not catch it in person? Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox, wherever they get their podcasts, as this show's available on all major podcast platforms. All right, so I know Josh Rojas is sticking at your craw by how he's getting everyday playing time. I mean, how annoying is it to see him get playing time when one of the, basically the prize that you got at the trade deadline is Curtis Mead sitting there not getting any at-bats because I don't know why, because Miguel Vargas is injured. This would be the perfect time to get some data on Mead.
Yeah, I'm done. I'm done with Josh Rojas. Todd, I watch almost every White Sox game. just almost like probably 80% of 80% of games. I'll stick through most of the outs, even when they're down. I try to find reasons to watch and I stick it out. I saw the lineup come out for Tuesday night's game against Seattle, and I saw that Josh Rojas was, in the lineup again, playing third base or second base for the White Sox. I didn't watch the beginning of the game. I couldn't bring myself to watch it. I was so disgusted. And then right on cue, Josh Rojas, gets out on the second or third pitch of his at bat. He makes an error at second base, which leads to a home run that puts the White Sox behind. And he's a waste of space. This is, he no longer has a purpose on this team. He is a veteran player. It made sense to sign him. Like, I get why Chris Getz brought him in. I get why they gave him playing time earlier in the season. If he works out like Austin Slater did, you can flip him and maybe you get a piece for him. That's interesting. I get that. The deadline is passed. Josh Rojas no longer has purpose. I don't even care about his defensive versatility because he plays bad defense. This is like second base, third base, left field. I don't care. You do them all poorly. So, do you play 5 positions if you don't play one of them well? I think you play 0 positions, especially hitter. Yeah, out of like 1,300 players in Major League Baseball that have suited up this year, he's like third to last in WAR total with like negative 1.4 according to Fangraphs. Clearly, it's a topic I feel pretty passionately about, but Curtis Mead is sitting there. Brooks Baldwin has really turned it around this month and seems to be seeing the ball a lot better. And neither one of those guys can buy themselves everyday playing time because we have to keep doing the Josh Rojas. And I don't know why. The Sox always seem to find this guy, right? There's always one guy on the team that they're just going to beat into the ground and beat a dead horse by putting him out there in the lineup every day. We watched this for years with Leary Garcia, and, they seem to keep finding a new one to frustrate all of us.
Yeah, I mean, this is like this year's Nicky Lopez, where I was like, why is Nicky
Lopez last year? I mean, Jacob Amaya for the first 2 months of this season. There's always somebody, and Josh Rojas is the guy right now. I cannot wait to rejoice when he's off this team.
Yeah, I mean, at least with Amaya or Vinny Capra, for example, they were still relatively youngish. Maybe you never know, but it was like, Nicky Lopez, what are we doing? And it's the same thing with Josh Ross. And it's also like, just let him go. I mean, maybe a contender might, sign him for depth if somebody gets hurt. Or again, give him another opportunity to have playing time on a team that actually, a non-contender that actually has a legitimate injury, and they just need somebody to plug through. You actually, like you said, you have Brooks Baldwin and Curtis Mead that need the at-bats, and you are wasting your time with Josh Rojas.
And Lenyn Sosa, too. Like, I don't know what you want to do with Lenyn Sosa because he's earning his at-bats with how he's hitting. He's atrocious defensively. Pretty much anywhere you put him, he can be fine at second base. You can convince me he can be fine at third base. Don't put him at first base anymore. Is he a DH? Maybe, but if he's DHing, then Teal and Caro can't be in the same lineup together. Like, between Vargas, Sosa, Mead, Baldwin, Teal and Caro both wanting to be in the lineup at the same time. Like, there's no room, time, or space for Josh Rojas to be wasting a spot on this roster and playing time and valuable at-bats in August of a rebuilding year.
Yeah, and I think also, just circling back, I think with Lenyn Sosa, and I know your brother wrote about it on Southside Showdown, I think they did miss an opportunity to trade him because he walks a very fine line to be a value player right now. His OPS is near 750, but it's because he's got a high slug, but we've known it takes him forever to get going slugging percentage, and he's got a decent average. But if he doesn't walk, where's the OPS going to come from if he's not slugging, in terms of the value? And as you said, he's just so atrocious defensively. Yeah. What do you do with him? You could still potentially pawn him off. You could have pawned him off on the Yankees when they were looking for something, and they were potentially interested in him.
Yeah, I mean, Sosa, I'm in the trade Sosa camp only like for all the reasons you just listed, and he can't really be a DH to me. Like, can he be a DH on a rebuilding club like the 2025 White Sox? Yeah, but I mean, I certainly think you're looking to get better offensive production from a DH on a contending team than 15 home runs and a 750 OPS that plays at second base. It doesn't really play from an everyday designated hitter, and certainly not a first baseman or third baseman, one of those corner infield spots. And so I just have a hard time seeing where the Sosa long-term where his place is with the organization. So for me, maybe it's not at the deadline, but I do think this offseason, look for one of those contending teams that's trying to go all in, that maybe has a hole at second base and wants more offensive output there. And you can give them a Lenyn Sosa and get something back. On paper, the White Sox have a lot of their 2026 roster already sort of figured out for the most part. There's not that many spots to go around, but I do think Chris Getz is going to have a few surprises up his sleeve, trade some guys, move off of some guys that we might not be expecting. And Sosa right now is one that I have highlighted as being the odd man out.
All right. So, and even if you get a guy like Gage Zeal, for example, like they got for Austin Slater, I'll take that. And speaking of that, so which of the three pitchers did you like the most that the White Sox got back at the deadline?
I think they're all different for very different reasons. I do think Gage Zeal is probably my favorite of the group, mainly because he's got control. And I think that's a pretty rare skill for a prospect of his status, right? Often you see prospects that get dealt in these deals and you're like, electric stuff, but can he really harness it? And Gage Zeal seems to have a pretty high floor for a prospect that's also was top 10 in the Yankees farm system because he has elite control. He's a strike thrower. He commands all of his pitches very well. I think that will serve him well in the White Sox organization. He's pitched all the way up at 3 levels of the minor leagues, as high as AA this year in his first professional season. And so he could be a guy that moves pretty quickly, finishes the year out at Winston-Salem with the White Sox, and opens 2026 in Birmingham with the possibility of, debuting in 26 or 27. So Duncan Davitt, Ben Peoples, 2 guys who probably will have big league impacts at some point, probably both project as relief pitchers. But Gage Zeal, legitimate starter, can get deep into games, can control his full arsenal, and I like that profile a lot, especially as the return for 120 at-bats of Austin Slater, which is what the White Sox gave the Yankees.
All right, final question. And I remember I jumped at the chance when you threw it out in the Slack chat about what topics to take. I wanted to take the Konnor Griffin not being picked by the White Sox because I was a Konnor Griffin guy last year. I'm not totally upset about the Hagen Smith pick, but it's still, when you look at what Konnor Griffin's doing, what Jack Caglione was doing, what even JJ Weatherholt, another hitter that they were tied to, what they're doing compared to what Hagen Smith is doing, just how badly does it look again for the White Sox that Konnor Griffin is now the number 1 overall prospect, at least per MLB pipeline?
Yeah, this one stings. It really, really stings. There's not much about this rebuild so far, realistically, to complain about in like the Chris Getz era. Like 2024, absolute disaster. But when you look at 2025, when you look at the Edgar Caro, Kyle Teal, Colson Montgomery, Chase Mydroth wave, when you look at the way that they've established, lots and lots of depth for young pitchers, there's a lot to like. You start to see the vision. And the one thing that would really put it over the top is a superstar position player prospect. White Sox fans are crossing their fingers that that's Billy Carlson in a few years once he finally suits up in pro ball. But had they selected a Konnor Griffin or a Jack Caglione, like you said, to a lesser extent, JJ Weatherholt in that draft, I mean, wow, what a time to be a White Sox fan it would be if you were looking at Braden Montgomery and Konnor Griffin getting ready to come and help your outfield with this young core already established. Hagen Smith has a lot of concerns, production aside, because his production hasn't been exceptional in Birmingham. The arm issues, the fact that he's a somewhat inexperienced starting pitcher and he's already having innings limits at 40 innings for a season, and he can't just go out there and rip off 6-7 inning starts. There's a lot that gives me pause with the Hagen Smith profile. And even if he is good, let's go ahead and look at the starting rotation right now. Davis Martin, not going anywhere. Shane Smith, a lot of control. Sean Burke, a lot of control. You've got Mason Adams and Drew Thorpe and Jonathan Cannon. Like there's Shane Murphy is doing unbelievable things in Birmingham right now. You've got Tanner McDougal looking like he's ready for an MLB shot. There are so many pitchers, Noah Schultz, one of them, that you don't even know where Hagen Smith is going to fit in, even if he is a good, well-rounded prospect doing what he's supposed to be doing right now. So possibly looking like the biggest black eye of this new regime of Mike Shirley, of Chris Getz, and the way the White Sox have been doing business recently is not taking a Konnor Griffin type of guy in the 2024 draft.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the all-new Locked On MLB Game Night. Every game, every night, all season long. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find MLB Game Night on Locked On MLB on YouTube or if you listen to your podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow with regretting being excited about the White Sox playing the Mariners. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion with Sam Phalen of SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the FanSided Network, and also of Survivor fame. You can leave them at the episode page on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, at ToddJDub or at Locked On Sox, or you can email me at LockedOnWhiteSox@gmail.com. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.